The worst in the world is China. They've been in the process of updating their data over the course of the last couple of years, and they're now starting to publicly admit that they overcounted by 100 million people. All of those people would have been born since one child, so age 40 and under, the young worker demographic, the childbearing demographic, and 2/3 of them are probably women. So best guess is that China only has 1.3 billion people now. The population probably peaked more than 10 years ago. And by 2030, there will be more retirees than workers. And by 2050, the entire population of China will have dropped below 650 million. Sure. Well, there's two things. First of all, of course, is one child. Mao was concerned that they had a young upcoming generation after World War II that was going to eat the country alive. So they went to a two-child policy, ultimately to a one-child policy, and that was not loosened until 2015. But by that point, the damage was already done because there was a second factor. Remember, countries that industrialize later can follow the path of those who came before. They can skip some steps. So China was the fastest ever industrialization experience. What the United Kingdom did in 7 generations, the Chinese did in 1. And so they crammed 7 generations of economic growth and development into 1. And that's why their growth rate has been so impressive. But you can only do that once. And now it's behind them. And now they have no children. And they have very few people under age 45. You're absolutely right there. Now, I don't want to say that unchecked population growth is necessarily the way to go. That's not what I'm after here. I mean, you require a balance between children, young workers, and mature workers. If you don't have enough mature workers, you don't have the capital. If you don't have enough young workers, you don't have the consumption. If you don't have the children, you don't have a future. China is already out of those last two categories. And so we know where this leads. It leads to zero. Well, it depends upon how you apply the lessons to your system. In the case of Europe, I'd say they got it 3 times. But there's definitely an upper limit. One of the things to keep in mind, especially when you're talking about European demographics, is that in Europe, people are not living longer. Overall lifespan has not improved. What's improved is we've gotten rid of a lot of mortality. So the things that used to kill you when you were 0 to 65 don't kill you anymore. In the case of sub-Saharan Africa, and this is a very broad array of countries, it's very difficult to make a generalization. They've started to industrialize. And so they're going down the same path that everybody else did. And the first step of that path is lowering infant and child mortality. And so when 1 out of 3 children don't die, you have an explosion in your birth rate. But if you play that forward 10, 15 years, then you start having adjustments in family planning and you get smaller and smaller families as urbanization kicks in. The danger for countries that are in this category who've taken the first but not the second step is that they've imported a lot of the technologies of industrialization, which has helped them out, but they have not developed the systems to sustain that themselves. So if something happens to the outside environment, they lose all of the benefits.
What like?
Healthcare, medicines, fertilizers. It's very easy for me to see a lot of these countries facing famine in the not too distant future, because if you break down globalization, yes, that means it's difficult to get oil or manufactured goods. I'm more concerned about agriculture. Agriculture is by far the most delicate and vulnerable of the economic sectors because it needs the equipment, it needs the finance, it needs the fertilizers, it needs the trade options. You break any of those, the whole system falls apart. And with the Ukraine war, we are seeing massive disruptions to the fertilizer sector. With some of the decisions the Chinese have made, same thing. So we're already looking this year at losing roughly 1/3 of global fertilizer supply. That is going to haunt us for a decade. It's a wide array of factors. So when you move into a city, you have less room, and that just changes the mechanics of raising kids. When you move off the farm, kids are no longer free labor. You have fewer of them. When you urbanize, when you have electricity, you've generated time. And so people can do things after sunset. This is important for everything in terms of economic development, but it's most important for women. Because if a woman moves off the farm and into the city and all of a sudden can do something after hours, you have the opportunity for mass education and freeing them from doing more than just being mothers. Nothing wrong with being a mother, but it's a full-time job on the farm. In the city, you're going to have fewer kids, that's less time allotted, and you have a greater chance to, read. And so the entire women's right movement is basically linked indelibly to electricity. It's getting difficult to get good information out of China. It's really devolved into a cult of personality state, even stricter than what Mao Zedong had. I don't think that the Chinese have a food crisis that is impacting their ability to have calories at the moment. Chinese land is among the worst in the world, and so it requires a huge amount of fertilizer to grow anything, specifically phosphate for rice. It's by far the world's most phosphate-hungry crop, and the Chinese traditionally, because of that, have been the world's largest producer and exporter of the stuff. The problem is actually with African swine fever. Now, you may have heard of that a few years ago. They had a big outbreak. They ended up culling more hogs from their farms than the rest of the world's commercial farms have hogs. Just give you an idea of just how lopsided the pork market is. It's 2/3 of it is China. They went to rebuild their herds, but they never abrogated the debts for the farmers who went out of business. They just offered subsidies to bring in new people. They thought that would be cheaper. Well, you have now 2 million new hog farmers in China who have no idea what they're doing. And let's just say that phytosanitary does not translate into Mandarin well in the first place. So we're probably in the early stages of a second wave of ASF that'll probably be just as bad, if not worse, than the first one. So pork, just like it did 2-3 years ago, is about to fall off the market in China completely. That just leaves rice. So the Chinese have banned the export of phosphate fertilizer. In the short term, this is causing massive problems in agricultural producers in East and South Asia. Australia, especially Western Australia, is probably the part that's gotten hit hardest. Brazil is feeling the impacts. Western Australia and Brazil basically can't grow without fertilizer. They don't have soil in the way that we think of the term. It's a weird geology. But you interrupt the input flows, and it's very difficult to grow food at volume. And China, in the best of times, is on a razor's edge in terms of food sustainability, and they use about 3 to 6 times as much fertilizer as is used in the global average, just because their land is so poor. Luckily, phosphate they've got covered. They produce that themselves, but the nitrogen is all made with imported natural gas, and the phosphate, the potash, half of that comes from a different continent. So, yeah, China, demographic collapse, unavoidable. The question is, what would you do if you're China? Where would you go to get what you want? If you go into Kazakhstan, fine, but what does the winner get? You can't go to India. Himalayas are in the way. You could go into Vietnam, but when the Chinese did that last in 1979, they got treated just as well as the Americans were. And so that was a quick war. They don't have the Navy to push out. Japan and Taiwan,